Adelante, Grant.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for the invitation to once again return and participate in this very meaningful event here. I am truly happy to be here. You could see from the photograph that my smile was sincere to receive an honor here, far from where I think I should be honored. I did not enter this field deliberately. I began out of an interest in the history of photography. It brought me to Rochester, New York, because there was no other place on earth at that time in which you could access so much information relative to the history of photography from its beginning to the current time. The one institution that functionally was the museum for the world of photography was the George Eastman House. That has an interesting history in itself. It didn't come into existence until the 100th anniversary of photography, 1939, and it came out of a need to do something with George Eastman's house, which was going to be empty, and there was a problem with, well, what do you do with it? And someone at the Kodak company suggested, well, let's make a museum of photography out of it. The formal need for training in photograph preservation, conservation, collection management did not really come into existence until photography, and more properly speaking, certain photographs began to have a collecting value, a market value as art or historic rarity. And that didn't really come until the late 1960s and early 1970s. I'm not here to give a history of that aspect of photography, but before the 1970s, many different types of professionals, either charged with the responsibility of caring for a valued collection of photographs, or having a collection in which there were many photographs integrated into other collections, that certain individuals began to see an opportunity to become specialists in essentially the restoration of certain valued and valuable photographs. Before that, librarians, archivists, photographers, private collectors had the responsibility for caring for these things. Not until 100 years did it become evident that there was a real mass that presented problems as a mass, not individually, but as a large amount of things that needed particular attention if you were going to maintain their value. Now, they may have been valued as historic documents, or as art, or as artifacts of someone's life, but not until it became apparent that there was a large problem in which the necessity for specialized knowledge about the nature of particular types of photographs, as well as all photographs in general, that this need drove, I don't know what, the creation of the idea of a professional training, or a professional who had the authority and the knowledge, who could answer questions for everyone. There was no place on earth you could go, except it seemed that maybe Rochester, because of the industry of photography, 100 years of that industry being in Rochester, the Museum of Photography that was at George Eastman House, maybe that was a place you could get answers. So asking photographers what do I do about this photograph? That was one of the things you could get some authoritative answer. Asking the industry, the scientists, the engineers, the people in charge of the creation of photographic materials, what do you do with this thing that is presenting a problem? That comes very, very late. And certain individuals started to present themselves as authorities who could answer these questions. But these people were not trained specifically to be, let's call them conservators. They are coming from places and disciplines and interests outside of that formal profession that now more than ever is a credentialed profession, that is conservation. Conservators generally have credentials, they are formally trained in some program and have a degree, and that's a relatively new thing in the world that develops really after World War II. Anyway, the point is, it's a new thing. I got into it backwards. I went to the Eastman House to learn about the history, to indulge in looking at the collection, being in a community of other people who had similar interests. And at that time, and that was in 1974, the Eastman House had just created a laboratory specifically devoted to the care of the collection. It's called the Conservation Laboratory, a photograph conservation laboratory. And of course, the Eastman House collection was not just photographs. There were books, there was apparatus, there were motion pictures. But the laboratory had the mission of caring for photographic materials in specific. That institutional position was first filled by Jose Araca, who's departed now, but a man who really was a pioneer in the establishment of the profession of photograph conservator. And he had had an interest similar in the history of photography. He had been trained as a paper conservator and then began to see, well, photography could use a professional who had a specific focus on photographic materials, largely in terms of treatment, the treatment of individual photographs with problems, and particularly the treatment of important, rare, fine, highly valued photographs. He left the museum to establish an academic program to train other photographic conservators, and established the first formal training program with a university behind it in Cooperstown, New York. What year is this we're really talking about? You're talking about 1972, 73. It's hard to find anyone before that who has an official presence as an authority, enough authority to be treating photographs. It's one thing to say, put it in a refrigerator, keep it out of light. It's another thing to be taking it apart and putting it back together again. That's a new thing, still a new thing, even though now it's 40 years ago or something like that. It's new. From that, I got the position working as a technician, making mats, and one day somebody said to me, "You're the conservator now." So that's my training, you see. I have a fine arts background. I never studied photography formally. But I wound up in a position of importance in the development of the field, and fundamentally allowed other people to share my opportunity. People came from all sorts and still come from all sorts of different interests, different professions, different levels of knowledge. There are two roads to photograph conservation. One is I love photography, and I think it's interesting to deal with the problems and solutions to permanence. The other road is I love conservation. It's a different road. I love conservation, I love preservation, and I want to learn more about photographs. That seems to be interesting. My choice is always for the I love photography people. It's a difference. If you don't love photography, and I don't like the term love exactly, but somehow you're compelled by something about photography that has drawn you to it, drawing you deeply into a place in the universe of photography that's not about making images, but about caring for images. If you look at the etymology for the word care, it means trouble. Kara is trouble. By caring for something, you're assuming the troubles of it. If I care for you, I have troubles of my own, but your troubles are my troubles too. You're welcome. I care for you. You take the troubles of somebody else on. Thank you. Yes. Big favor. The troubles of photography. This is what really we're talking about when we're talking about conservation or preservation or management of photographic materials. And there's lots of trouble. Highly, highly complex problems that are very, very difficult to solve. Over the 30 years of working at the museum and working in collaboration, largely with Jim Riley, who is now director of the Image Permanence Institute, we gradually developed a certain approach to establishing a sort of fundamental knowledge. Since people come from all sorts of different backgrounds, all sorts of motivations, a great variety of skills and knowledge, asking for education, it was necessary to bring everybody to some common understanding. Photography is tremendously complex. Photographs are tremendously complex. The history of photography is super complex. It's very hard to transmit the knowledge that is required to be truly a well-trained professional who could take on these problems. It was necessary to bring down this complexity to some simplicity, to bring everyone to the same level. And from there, to build up. So a foundation education, the idea of a foundation education. Well, what would that be? Where do you start? What's the topics? What's the curriculum? Currently, today in the world, there's only one academic training program in which you can get a degree that says you are a photograph conservator in the United States. One. There's 4 different programs for conservation. One only that will give you a degree that says you're a photograph conservation. There's one program in Canada. There's one program in France. There's one program, I think now, there was 2 in Germany, one in East Germany, and one in West Germany. I think there's only one now. There may be one in Spain. Outside of that, considering how many photographs there are, considering that photography has been an international technology virtually from its emergence in 1840, 41, 42, 43, what photography was in New York was the same as what photography was in Montevideo in terms of what type of camera, what type of material, what process that was used. It's not significantly different. This is one of the aspects that make it so important. It's not so significantly different in virtually every place on Earth. It reached various places at various different times, but what reached it was what was current at that time everywhere else. Anyway, I'm going to show you, I'm not to teach you with what this is, but I'm going to show you what was the basic approach to coming to some generic place, some foundational understanding, where to start to understand the what do you, the problems of, no, you have to start with understanding photography before you deal with the problems of photography. That's no easy thing. This now looks dated to me. I'm retired from the Eastman House. It certainly is dated. 5 years I'm retired. But this presentation was the presentation that was used in an annual seminar for professionals who are already advanced in their careers, but curators, collectors, dealers, archivists, librarians, people who already had an extensive experience with photographs, to try to move them to a common understanding and a timely understanding. What now did you need to know? Over the years that changed. So there was in 1970 a great need to understand the stability issue of color photographs. Very hot topic. Nobody talks about it anymore. It is no longer the issue it was. Let me show you. So it started with trying to understand the photographic object. And now here's an important thing to point out. Image is one thing. The object that carries the image is another. And until recently, that was the issue. Now we deal with images without the object that carries the image, right? It's insubstantial. This is, I will address this towards the end of my talk. But the basic thing that had to be understood is the generic model for the composition of most photographs. And that model you had to understand in cross-section. So there are 3 elements you should look at any photograph that's an object and ask what is the imaging substance, and in particular the final image material substance. It isn't always what it is at the beginning of the process. For instance, in chromogenic color, the image is first formed with silver and ends up with dye as the imaging substance. Very complex, that transition. But it's the final imaging substance that you're seeing, and that you should be able to identify. What holds that imaging substance, the binder? It may be an emulsion, it may be something else, not a true emulsion. Better to think of it generically as a binder, something that holds, that carries, and the support material. There may be 6, 7, 8 layers in a photograph, but if you don't understand those 3 aspects of the photographic object, you don't understand the photograph. So, why is that important? Well, that's what varies over time. Photography has been a changing technology. What's changing exactly? Yes, we understand it's changing, but what's changing? Well, things like in the final imaging material at certain times, and the most dominant material that has been used in the last 160 years in photography has been silver. It's silver-based imaging technology. But there are other materials that were used, but were not the most common. Perhaps they were having no commercial life at all, but were alternative ways to make photographs. So silver, platinum, iron complex, pigments, and dyes have been used as final imaging materials in photography. The binder materials have varied. Albumin, gelatin, collodion. So if I mentioned to someone that for many years photography was not for vegetarians, what are you talking about? Well, if you had to see all the pigs that died in the creation of your film, you might not choose to be a photographer even, right? You have no idea that aspect of that. How many eggs have been consumed over the years in photography? Well, that's not part of the history of photography, eggs, right? Plenty. And collodion, what is collodion? It's a plastic. It's a plastic. The support materials have varied over time. Paper, glass, metal in the case of the daguerreotype, silver on a copper support, and plastic materials. The problem is that they're not just sequential, they'll change. One period, mercury on a silver binder on a copper support, the daguerreotype. Another period, silver in egg white, albumin on paper. Another period, again, silver in gelatin on paper, plastic. It hasn't all been successive. Anyway, from the beginning, two parallels in photography divided and progressed. One was the daguerreotype process and the other photography on paper. The daguerreotype was commercially dominant for 15 years. It was the way in which the world learned about photography. It drove the development of photography. It established the business of photography, the industry of photography. Paper-based photography did not have a great commercial life. These are aspects about photography that are important to understand, is that there are many ways to make a photograph, but fundamentally one commercially dominant system in a certain period. One choice for most that makes the most money for the industry. The other choices are not money makers. Well, going on again, the pointing out what is the most common form of photography at a certain period of time, and what is it composed of, and what was it applied to, must be understood in incremental periods. So we broke it down in these ways. The process names, which do not truly express what they're made of. There's no tin, for instance, in a tin type. The ferrotype process is what it should be called, but it's the support material. Right? So there's many terms in photography that are not expressive at all of what they're made out of. The positive and the negative. The negative, which comes first, chicken or the egg? Well, that's hard to answer, but which came first in photography for most of the period from 1860 to 1960? The negative comes first, and from the negative, the positive. Today, with digital, the negative is gone. It's not part of photography for most people today. Not fundamental to it. Not commonly understood that that's a big change. There are vast numbers of negatives in collections everywhere, and there's going to be tremendous amount more that will wind up in collections everywhere, and they're a special problem because they're in negative. You can't see them easily. They're made out of funny things. You can't get the image value out of it immediately without extra work. It's a big problem. In the 1980s, it was the biggest focus of photograph conservation, the copy and duplication issue of negatives. Anyway, so process, but process in a certain context, understanding generically what it's made out of, the period that it is most commonly used, and the most typical problems that they manifest. So much of the craft of photography, from really 1860 up until 1980, had to do with retouching, handwork applied to the photograph, the negative as well as the positive. It was a big part of photography. Generally not seen, and certainly not much of a profession anymore. Anyway, you get the idea. Here's a historic thing. When I came to the museum in 1970, I think it was 4, any plastic-based negative that looked weird, they thought was nitrate deterioration. It took 10 years for it to be discerned that this type of deterioration is acetate-based film deterioration, safety-based film. It's a shrinking of the plastic. The gelatin does not shrink, it cockles, it delaminates, it becomes unprintable. It was quite a long time before this was discerned as particularly a problem, separate from the nitrate problem. And partially that was because it hadn't started on a grand scale to appear in collections everywhere. Safety-based film was introduced in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. 50 years later, it starts to appear. 50 years after, already nitrate is well known to be a problem, plastic material a problem. So it takes really quite a long time for somebody to discern a problem in photography, and then it's usually vast. Format, understanding the different presentation aesthetics of photographs. The card-mounted photograph. Why are they card-mounted? It's because they were popularized first. Paper photographs with popular use were albumin prints. To make the paper coated with the albumin binder, it had to be floated. The paper had to be thin in order to lie flat on the bath. And after you made it, it was too flimsy or would curl up on its own. It necessitated to be mounted in order to be used and seen. It's not a choice of, well, we like visiting cards. It's a choice that has to be glued down to something, a different practical thing. But understanding formats, and again, formats in certain periods of time, which are the most common and dominant, are very helpful foundational information. That plastics were used in motion picture as well as sheet film, and to some extent also in positive film, and positive prints, but rarely seen. We'll go on. You get the picture. Here's a concept that's basic, that's lost to most people. The difference between printing out and developing out. You all understand the difference, right? I'm not going to tell you what it is. Printing out, developing out, it's not in your common language. What are you talking about? Contact printing or enlarging? No. Contact printing, direct action of light, forming chemical change, a darkening of silver, printing by contact. and printing an exposure by contact, no image appearing, and chemical development of the image. Why would you want both systems? Why would you need that? You got to have a real clear understanding of that. The two different systems of producing the image, P.O.P, printing out process, and D.O.P, developed out process, produces a different size image particle, a tremendously different size and a tremendously different shape. What does that matter? Well, it's the difference between a red image and a black and white image, right? The imaging substance being red or the image substance being black. That's very critical here because that's also a factor in deterioration. Understanding the timeline of photography. Which processes are dominant in which period is absolutely foundational knowledge. So understanding that if you tell me you have a paper support photograph from the 19th century, with my eyes closed, if I say albumin print, I'll be right 80% of the time without seeing it. 80% of the time, because it was that dominant for that long as the main system of paper print, right? So in 1960, for instance, the first year more color photographs were made than monochromatic photographs. Ever since then, most photographs were made in color. So if you say you have a photograph, again, I have a photograph from 1920. It's monochromatic, I say. I'm going to be right 90%, 95% of the time. This timeline is important eventually. The formats, understanding the formats relative to a timeline, understanding layer structures. There are 1 layer, 2 layer, 3 layer in the generic model. How do you look at a photograph? When I'm given a photograph to examine, I turn it over. I look at the back first. It's a complete opposite way of addressing the photograph. From the back, I start and work my way to the front. Even with the daguerreotype I have here, and this is an important point too, the objectness of the photograph, it starts out very much as a thing, three-dimensional. It has a weight. You give me a daguerreotype to look at, I look at the case first, the side, the front, the back. Most people open it immediately. Now, what am I looking at? We can talk about that. As a matter of fact, tomorrow is what I talk about. But looking not at the image, but at the object, making observations about the surface quality of a photograph. Surface really matters in photography. The look of the photograph is very much determined by the surface. The surface quality. Is it smooth? Is it textured? Is it very shiny? Is it very dull? And in order to see that, you have to see it, you're not looking at the image. You have to see it in lighting circumstance. That is not the normal way of looking at the photograph. The characteristics of different surfaces. Magnification. Looking at the photograph under magnification. Not have to be very, very high magnification, but magnification shows you certain characteristics which are unique to certain processes. When you see a certain type of deterioration, it may be telling you what type of process it is. This is an example of a platinum-toned collodion printing out paper. The imaging substance is essentially silver that has been toned and essentially coated with platinum in a collodion, a plastic binder on a paper support. Platinum is a very stable imaging material, but it causes the catalytic degradation of other materials. So the image, the counter-strike image, is a provocation of the deterioration of the paper from this silver platinum imaging substance. So when you see this, you're pretty sure there's platinum around. Do all platinum prints do it? No. Do all images that seem to have transferred, are they caused by platinum deterioration? No. But it's very characteristic of a certain type. You have to eliminate, and it's very much a process of elimination that helps you to identify the object and the deterioration. Very important thing to point out, not only do photographs deteriorate, but they deteriorate other things. Be careful where you put your photograph. Developing out papers, blah, 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 so you see gaslight papers. There's all sorts of terminology. Here's something that people don't get today. Toning or not toning. Gold toning, sulfur toning, selenium toning, platinum toning. What's that about? What's toning about? It was as much an aspect of stability, establishing stability for the image, as it was aesthetic issue. It's not commonly understood even by people who practice silver halide photography today. How do you judge? And you don't have to know what it is, but you have to see the characteristics of a photograph first before you can begin to answer. Why such a variety of surfaces in gelatin developed out papers of the 20th century, black and white? When I was a boy, you'd get your photographs back from the photo finisher through the drugstore. They were all glossy. Was that the only type of paper surface you could get? No. Why did I get all my photographs glossy? I didn't ask for it. Being able to answer that question is part of the business of taking care of photographs. Non-silver surfaces, there are things that look like albumin prints that have no silver, that have no albumin. There are things in funny colors. Here, the difference of photographer-made or finisher-produced prints or mechanically generated prints as opposed to hand-generated prints. It's an important part of the story of photography. What you know about it is probably hardly anything. You certainly don't know much about the history of it. But here in this slide, we're being told that 95% of the materials being used, right, and a hell of a lot of the prints were produced by mechanical finishers. Okay. Here is now a very important point. It took us a long, long time to make the point to other people that photography, that photographs needed special care. And the argument was there were things that looked like photographs that weren't photographs. So ink on paper, photomechanical reproduction, which had as its goal the reproduction of photographic qualities in great number copies, more permanent than silver-based imagery. Preservation was actually one of the forces that drove the development of photomechanical systems of photography. Ink on paper is not a photograph. There was a clear mark that could be set. If it's ink on paper, send it to the paper conservator. They deal with ink on paper. If it's silver in gelatin on paper, that's the business of a photograph conservator. Well, today, ink on paper is a photograph, is treated like a photograph, is talked about like a photograph. So your inkjet print, which is ink on paper, functions like a photograph, is thought to be a photograph. That's a big change. How did it change? Not a photograph to a photograph. And photograph conservators have to concern themselves now with ink on paper as well as silver-based or platinum-based or whatever. Here's a corrupted slide. Anyway, being able to discern the difference between a photomechanical reproduction and a true photograph is a very important aspect of the business here. If you're going to be a caretaker of photographic materials, you have to be able to answer the question, what is a photograph? If I ask you individually, I won't do that, what's your definition of a photograph? Not photography, but photograph. What would your definition be? That'd probably be different for every one of you. It's a question you're not ready to answer. You might come up with a good answer or a bad answer as far as I was concerned. For me, a photograph had to be light sensitive at some point during the course of its making, right? To be considered to be a true photograph. Not a generation of something that came from a photograph. So the discernment, yes, that's a photograph, no, that's not a photograph, is important in my concept here. But we, with this change in the technology of photography, in which photography actually is a subset of other technologies, of information technologies, of other imaging technologies, of communication technologies, of entertainment technologies. It's about the picture, not about the thing. It's not about the process that generates the picture. It's about the picture. We're living in a culture that fundamentally is now dealing with many, many types of ways of forming an image, transmitting an image, storing an image. It's not all photography. Some of it is photography, I would say. But that's an old-fashioned thing. Better for me to say it's imaging. Hooray for images. I love imaging. We live in a great time. It's all good. Well, it doesn't work for the training of conservators. Now there are two professions. There's those people who care for the long-term access and preservation of images, and those who deal with long-term access and preservation to photographic objects. And the training is different, has to be different, hasn't yet begun to form. Those are two different professions. As caretakers, as librarians, curators, etc., you may have both forms of materials in your collection, but the preservation of them, they're different issues, absolutely, and who you're going to get to care for them. The difference between caring for a lot of photographs and caring for one photograph is a big difference. If you go into training, are you going to train to be the specialist in the highly valuable, rare, artistically usually as well as historically important, even in the history of art, photographic object? Or are you going to deal with the vast amount of digital information that has to be maintained over time, some way by migration in some device? It's not the same thing you're studying. The objects that are generated from digital records are varied, tremendously varied, and varying all the time. They're not as consistent as photography was for 160 years. Even though it changed all the time, it fundamentally was silver halide-based imaging and was really limited to a few different materials and stayed consistent for decades, where today, almost every day, you're dealing with a different type of image object, and it's going to continue to change. So this issue of, well, not who or where is going to be a place where you can study the subject. And conservation isn't the right word, really. It doesn't really serve the problem here. What is conservation anyway? In some countries, the word doesn't exist. The profession doesn't exist. Let's call it, what am I going to call it? What term is the right term here? The caretaker, manager of photographic materials, superintendent. There's no right word. If you want to be a photograph conservator, well, all right, where are you going to go? France, England. It's hard to get a degree in it in England. Germany, it is. Strangely enough, here's a funny thing. The countries that are responsible for photographic technology from the 1840s on, England, France, Germany, the United States, those are the 4 countries where photographs were produced, the technology evolved, the industry was centered. Of those countries, which are the ones that have conservators of photographs? England has 3 or 4. It should have 304. The legacy that is maintained in England is great in photography. But why are there only 3 or 4? France, there's at least 44. What? What's the difference? The United States? Maybe 30, 40 people who have a full-time professional role as a photograph conservator. It's not a lot of people, but there's a lot of photographs, right? And this is maybe my most important point. Although photography has changed, and hooray or boo-hoo, it doesn't matter to me, there is still the 160-year legacy of chemical imaging. That didn't go away. They're not making them the same way anymore. They're not making images by the old system of photography. But the photographs, the product of 160 years is still here. It didn't go away. Looking at the legacy of photography, and let me make this point too, it's not just photographs. It's apparatus, it's literature. It's integrated into other media. This legacy needs to be cared for, even if it's drag it out and throw it in the garbage. Right? We don't want to be bothered with it anymore. That goes on all the time, and it's going to be worse because it will be less understood, more of a problem, and there'll be less people capable of helping you with the problem, not more people. In order to go forward from this point, it would be absolutely essential to capture now certain resources necessary to learn and teach about the materials of the legacy of photography. Well, what would that be? What am I talking about? Medical schools need cadavers. They need to cut up dead people in order to teach you how to care for live people, right? History of medicine is a lot about its progress, has to do with dealing with how many cadavers can you get today. Right? Well, you need cadavers. You need photographs you can throw in water, rub with alcohol, smell. Where are you going to get them? Well, there's lots of photographs to get, but which are the right ones to get? And who's going to say this is a dead photograph? Is this a dead photograph or a live photograph? Wow, what are you talking about, Grant? Does this preserve much of its original character? Does it still have the message that it had 150 years ago? Was this well taken care of and is not suffering from any particular big problem that's making my nose itch or my skin break out in hives or my hands dirty? I wear gloves to keep my hands clean, not to keep artwork clean. Because artwork is usually pretty dirty, at least the stuff that they ask conservators to deal with. Right? Now, I don't really wear gloves, but you should wear gloves to keep your hands clean. Look, look, look. This got through 150 years. There's no treatment. It's still in super duper. Yeah, you can see from there, this is beautiful. Right? What is that? This a little thing. It's hardly considered to be photography in the history of photography. Oh, the daguerreotype wasn't so good, and it was weird, and it's an astonishingly beautiful thing. Even if it just makes shine, you can get a monkey to come down out of a tree. Right? They used to bring beads and mirrors to primitive people, right? That's part of its appeal. Anyway, where are you going to get one of these? Even to teach with, this is a daguerreotype. Unless you see a daguerreotype, you don't know what it is. I can show you beautiful images of daguerreotypes, but I'm not showing you the daguerreotype. I'm showing you some translation of this image into some other form. This object is not translated so fully. So even just as an exemplar, and it's very important to have the experience of holding it in the hand, because it's all about it being in the hand, this object. See, it's the size of the human palm. You think that's an accident? There's no accident. That's part of the design. That's not about the limitation of the daguerreotype. That's about the commercialization of the daguerreotype, being able to sell it to human beings. Here, hold it. Does it feel good? It feels good. Say it feels good. Well, think about it. Tell me when you think it's good. Where are you going to get one? I brought this down here. I'll leave this here. I'll leave it at the center. Ask Danielle to let you touch it. If everybody here touches it, is it going to be the same at the end of the day? A little greasier probably, but wouldn't look like it was any. As a matter of fact, it's covered with leather to hide as well as to please the hand. It's meant to hide the effect of being in the hand. We are much more primitive in regards to photography, in terms of our understanding of what photography is essentially, what photographs have been, the culture that produced it, their sensitivity, their intelligence, their resolution of putting photography into practical applications. And the issue of caretakership. This case is protective as well as decorative. It's pleasing to the sight as well as to the hand. It's functional. Look, nobody recommends store your photographs in wood, leather, cloth, and animal adhesives, and maybe metal, bronze, brass, coated with gold. That's what we recommend. Yet this simple thing, this highly vulnerable silver, which will tarnish in a couple of days if you leave it out, highly reactive with the atmosphere, it's got very little sign of 150 years. How does that work? Did they get it right by accident? No, they did not. This is design. It's a design that is pre-photographic. for portrait miniatures painted on ivory and parchment, very hygroscopic, very important to protect it with some atmospheric insulation. It was evolved before photography. The case. Try to get a good case today, by the way. And you'll see what's there. You need these things to not only teach with, but to learn by. I had no teacher who just taught me these things that I said to you. I had figured this gradually out. There's an interesting aspect to this case. One side has a beveled edge, an angled edge. The other top side has a rounded edge. See the difference? See, the edge is round, and this one angled. Why? Feel the difference. Hold it in your hand like this, and hold it in your hand like that. You feel any difference? Right. Which side feels better? Say the back. Yeah, yeah. No one will tell you that in the world, but me and somebody I told that to. It's been seen but not accounted for. Why that difference between the top and the bottom? Well, certain resources have to be secured. Those resources are the artifacts of photography that are exemplary of certain general trends in photography. Examples that are in good condition and examples that are not in good condition. Examples of high quality achievement in that form of photography. All daguerreotypes are not super well made and super beautiful. In any period, any material system of photography, only a small percentage were made at the high end of the possibility of that form of photography. So many albumin prints, all with general characteristic, but only some super well-made ones, technically super well-made, at the high end of the possibility. Most of the rest were pretty, and some very crappy. Your ability to see that, your understanding that only some photographs, in terms of technical achievement, are at the high end of technical achievement. And being able to see those, being able to see the photographs that are in great condition, you need to see photographs in great condition in multiple copies and against comparatively examples that are not. You need some of the apparatus, some of the tools. Most of the work of the treatment conservator falls into the category of the craft and history of photography in the finishing aspects, the trimming, the mounting, the retouching, the coloring, the surfacing. That's what the treatment conservator is dealing with. They have to understand how it was done and reconstitute it after this is a shiny surface, I do a treatment, it's not shiny anymore. How do I make it shiny? How do they make it shiny? Would be the first place to think, how do I make it shiny? How did they make it shiny? How did I unshine it? Right? It's finishing. Where are you going to learn about photo finishing, photo retouching today? You need the frame, the tools, the manual. You need people who can answer your questions, who will guide you, even if it is to say, I don't know. Who knows? I don't know who knows. Nobody knows. That answer is an answer if you've got a good question. You need a teacher who can give you the good questions if you don't have them yet yourself, give you the experiences that raise the question. Where are you going to get them? Where are the old photographers here? people who worked in the darkroom, people who did photo finishing, people who did retouching. Every day they're checking out and moving on. The history of the daguerreotype was 15 years of commercial practice and then abandoned very quickly, just like chemical imaging itself. 150, 60 years of practice and virtually abandoned in 4 or 5 years, not practiced commonly. Yes, there were guys who knew how to make it, but no one was asking them to make it. And soon, how these things were very well made was forgotten. Yes, you could read in a book how to make it, but how to make it well, that's an experience thing. There's still living memory of chemical imaging. Who's capturing that information? Right? We have great media. Who's interviewing old photographers and knowing what questions to ask? You could do it. They could be recording with my iPhone. I could record. Tell me, when did you first make a photograph? That's not the right question. Tell me how you made your first photograph is a better question. Who's making up the list of questions? If I wasn't a lazy man, I would make here 10 questions to ask an old photographer that everybody in the world who's interested in this could have. And know, yeah, you might get good answers, you might get bad answers, but if you don't have the right question, you're never going to get an answer at all. Here's the typical question: what should I do with my old photographs? I don't know. What should I do with this photograph? Well, what do you mean, what should you do? Well, I want to keep it forever. Oh, okay. Pay me $100. No, you know, you need a better question than what do I do with a photograph? What do I do with this type of photograph? How do I keep this photograph forever? What do you mean? What, the image or the object? Oh, this object. Oh, no, this image. If it's this image, make multiple copies. The redundancy of the record is the key to preservation. It's why there's so many, why the creator of humanity has made so many of them. A lot of unnecessary duplication. Oh yes, we're all unique and all that, but how many do you really need, right? Exactly. It's the biological imperative. The more, not the merrier, the more there is, the better chance that 2 or 3 will get through. You've got 10,000. If 2 get through to the next generation, that's enough, right? Why women and children first when the Titanic was sinking? Because we like them so much? Because we hate men so much? What was the criteria? Well, with lots of women and a few men, there'll be more human beings. With lots of men and a few women, there'll be a few less men very quickly. Right. I don't know. When it comes to photographs, this is an issue, though. Which are the ones worth saving? Since we cannot save them all, which are the ones that should receive the most attention? The ones in worse condition or the ones in best condition? The so-so ones or the super-duper ones? So what do you mean super-duper? That make this young man say beautiful? Well, it's a test, right? A response. Well, and I spoke yesterday to the workshop, or the day before, I don't remember. Some of the most important photographs ever made and culturally important, the very first, have been destroyed because people recognized the importance and took special attention, giving them lots of exhibition and lots of handling and lots of intervention, and have destroyed them. The ones that have survived in best condition are the ones that were forgotten and put in a closet somewhere and left alone for 150 years. If I showed you the truth of that, you'd go, ah! Right? So, but that there's enough of them that maybe one by accident is going, it's the redundancy of the record. The photographic record is tremendously redundant. Mama, mama, papa, baby, 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 birthday, 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 president, 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 assassination, assassination, war, 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 dead person, dead person, dead person, dead person, dead, lots of dead people, lots of new dead people, old dead, and people we don't know, we don't care about. Or it's precious to me, but it doesn't mean it's going to be precious to you. Right? Look at how sad this thing is. Who is that? I don't know. Why didn't the family keep it? Well, the photograph lasted longer than the family. Was it you, Fernando, that told me you had a dream that Martians came to the world and bought up all the daguerreotypes? What did they want them for? To eat them? Right. I've been told by another friend, your soul will stay on earth, on this, the lowest plane of existence, as long as your image is here. I'll let her go. I don't know. Very complex thing. But to reiterate my point, since I'm coming to the end, there is more interest in some ways, more wonderful imaging technology for sure, in terms of its capacity, your access to it, incredible advantages in the new form of technological imaging. I'm not going to call it photography. Right? Technological imaging. I'm all for it. It's wonderful. Hooray for that. Photography is dead. Good riddance. I don't care. I'm not making money from it anymore. But the legacy of the old form of photography is still there, and I can make money off of that. I can make a living off of that. Does that sound stupid? Is that my motivation? No, my motivation is to have special valuation of these things. But I cannot just say, I like this stuff and you should too. I have to be able to articulate in detail what are the special aspects of this form of imaging that warrants special value, and that value doesn't have to be monetary, but it has to be evident in order to be well cared for. If you don't see the value in something, you're not going to care about it. And anything that you have too much of is going to be valued much lower. And as been pointed out statistically, more exposures are made with the camera, and let's then say more photographs are made in a day today than were made in the entire 19th century. Are you going to value images that are so abundantly present? No. Anyone here just have one family photograph? You might because something horrible happened to your family and somebody kept only one. I've seen circumstances, but you usually have lots, too many, right? Actual objects that were light sensitive during the course of the time of their making and are things as well as images. We have lots of them, too many to really care for all of them. By what criteria are you going to make the choice of which ones should be cared for, and by what means are you going to be able to make other people care about what you discern as valuable and worth caring about? That has to be taught. The ability to do that has to be taught. That's part of the curriculum of a training program for anyone who wants to be professionally dedicated to really ultimately the appreciation of photography. But not photography as the nebulous thing, but the photographic legacy, the legacy of photography, what photography has given us. If I leave you $1 million, a legacy, I die, I leave each of you $1 million, you can do three things. You can keep that $1 million throughout your life and leave it to somebody else. You can spend it in your lifetime and have a good time doing it and leave nothing to somebody else, or only some of it to someone else. Or you can make more money and have it grow. Same thing with the legacy of photography. We can squander it. We can sort of keep it as it is, and no good or bad comes from it. Or we can make more of value out of it. That's the task that is really before us. And if you're not clear in your definition of what is a photograph, if you're not able to articulate it now and to me when we walk out of the room, you're not going to succeed. It's going to go the way of all things. The only reason we have so much of it, and here's one last thing, of what we have of the legacy of, let's say, the first 50 years of photography, we have much less than 1% of what was made. Let's say 1 billion were made. Of that billion, only 1% is around, and of that 1%, that's not all in good condition. It doesn't represent the all and the highest end of the production of that period. It is just the redundancy that has made, by some arbitrary system, it survived to now. Most of it's gone. Most of it is gone. In the United States, in 1851, the peak year of the daguerreotype production in the United States, 4 to 5 million daguerreotypes were made in a country that had 12 million people in it. But there aren't 5 million daguerreotypes in that, from that year alone. No, there's a very finite, small number of these in the world. And it's true of all the photographs of that period. I'm not opening a school. Go ask somebody else where you're going to get your education. I have a collection of this stuff, but it's going to the garbage with me, I think, really. Who wants it? The need for this isn't clear. Not you. Please give me your name and address and I will put you... No, I will. I'll leave you something. Thank you for... Thank you. Thank you all very much.